Stubbin.
Thank you, my lady. Ms O'Neill, I wonder if we could just finish off then and we'll move on to another topic. But just before we do, to finish on the 16th of March, please. And to just go, and perhaps we can call this up on screen, the inquiry has seen this on a number of occasions. It's INQ 000 308 444, please. This is a message from, thank you. This is a message from Sir David Stirling. I think this is a message that he sent to the CMO, but he sent another message that night to another senior official. And it's a reflection on the meeting that had taken place the previous night. And it's obviously not about you, Miss O'Neill, it's about the leadership that was on display at that meeting. And as you see, he describes the meeting as having been excruciating and that there was no leadership on display at all. I'm not asking you what he thought, but I wonder if you have any reflections or whether or not you understand why the most senior civil servant in Northern Ireland might have come to that view, or what it was about the conduct of that meeting that led him to have or to feel the need to say that.
I suppose the first thing to say is that, I can't comment on what he meant or what he's referring to, but I can say that there's no doubt it was a difficult meeting, but that doesn't equate to lack of leadership. I think that equates to the complexity of the issues in which we were dealing and trying to work our way through. So I can't really say much more than that's just his view, which he seems to share a lot behind the scenes with CMO.
Well, he shared it was a view he shared with other senior officials. I think we've seen, I won't go to it. It's not only that it's a special communication with the CMO, I think it goes broader than that. But reflecting upon that now, and knowing that that was the view that was taken at the time, I suppose the question is whether or not you do have any reflections on your leadership at that point in time, or whether you can see that there might have been an objective basis for his coming to that view.
No, I can't. I don't accept that it was a lack of leadership. I accept it was a difficult circumstance that we're trying to navigate our way through, and I accept that for the reasons that I've previously outlined to the inquiry in terms of my decision making and why I did what I did. So I don't reflect that commentary as necessarily a good descriptor of what we were trying to navigate. I've said that I believed that the optimum position would have been to arrive at an agreed position, but that wasn't the case.
All right, I'm going to move on then. Earlier in your evidence, you talked about planning, and I know that you've accepted that the position that really the planning came late in the day. But just to trace that through, and I did say that I would take you to this, so I want to do that. But if we go first of all, please, to INQ 000 86935. This is the return that the inquiry has already seen and understands from evidence that's been given about it that it's a summary of the plans as they stood at the 13th of March. And we've taken other witnesses to it. I can take you to it if needs be, but we can see the planning for schools. Appears to be no reflection that schools might close. The concerns are in other directions. I think you've accepted this, but plainly these plans are wholly inadequate, aren't they, for the position that had been reached as of mid-March?
Yes, they are, and they're very much referring to the risk that was presented at that time of moderate, but yes, I agree with you.
All right. Well, I'm not going to take you through all of those. And I think what you've said in your evidence is that when Karen Pearson was introduced, that's when there appeared to be a more, if I'm putting it in my words, but maybe you'll agree, a more coherent approach, perhaps,
Yes, I think
to planning.
Karen, to be fair to her, was a breath of fresh air in coming into the department to sort of bring all of this together and actually bring forward that coherent plan. So yes, I think her arrival to the department, I think around the 14th to the 16th, was a huge moment in terms of a gear shift.
All right. And if we go to then, I think this is the paper that sets out the planning framework that she, and we've seen this, but so that I can put it to you, please. It's at INQ 000086884. And we can see that she sets out the purpose of this paper was to seek agreement on the headline objectives for a planning framework to joined up whole society response to COVID-19.
Yes.
So I think, Ms O'Neill, consistent with what you've said, I think it's here that we see the nutshell of the joined up approach, and one that might have been expected a very considerable time before then. Yes?
Yes.
And I think if we go, please, we can see the work streams set out at 3. And again, I'm sure you'll agree, Miss O'Neill, they're probably just about as basic as could possibly be. Yes.
Basic and perhaps in appearance, but very wide catching in terms of the issues that we would have to address under each of those headlines. I think they're just work streams that encompass a lot of other work.
So if we go and look then at what the way it was proposed, the work streams would be set out, and if we can scroll down, please. I haven't, sorry, I thought that it had annexed the document, but I think that when we look and when we come to it, thank you, that is it. Thank you. If we look at paragraph 1, I think we see there, again, some of the very broad headlines, yes?
Yes.
About what might be expected in terms of a health response. And I think that perhaps in terms of the executive committee and its response, its oversight, I think this might be, for example, the first time we see reference to things like, or certainly a document that sets out something like, or refers to testing capacity. Do you agree?
Yeah, yes, I think so, yeah.
All right. I think that can come down, please. That document is dated the 19th of March, and Northern Ireland went into lockdown. I think the lockdown was announced on the 23rd of March, so within a few days of this plan having been formulated. And it must follow, I think, from everything that you've said in your evidence, Miss O'Neill, that Northern Ireland was probably woefully underprepared for going into a lockdown. Do you accept that?
Yes, absolutely. I think that you can't argue any different in terms of our preparedness for the combination of reasons that I've referred to previously, particularly in terms of austerity and what that meant for public services and a state of readiness within particularly the health system, but much wider than that, because obviously civil contingencies was also hugely impacted. The fact that we were preparing for Brexit and that any staff that were available on civil contingencies were focused on that area of work. So I think any objective assessment would say that the system itself wasn't ready to respond to the pandemic.
It's not
both,
just about...
Sorry to forgive me and to interrupt. I was going to ask you this earlier, but both Brexit and austerity applied to the whole of the UK.
Sure.
And what was the document that said that Northern Ireland was 18 months behind the rest of the UK in resilience? So I'm afraid austerity and Brexit can't explain why Northern Ireland was so far behind the rest of the UK.
I think we can align those things alongside the absence of the institutions working and leadership for the 3 years previous as well. I think I've said that in my previous statement, my lady. I'm sorry I didn't mention it just now. So I think it's a combination of factors. Yeah.
But it's also, isn't it, I think you must accept the lack of collective responsibility that was exercised over the response to the pandemic, particularly in February and into the middle of March 2020.
I think I've said that I thought the state of readiness in February wasn't as it were where it should be. Yeah.
Just looking then and as it were assessing the position at the point at which the lockdown was announced, we've obviously seen the school's decision and the announcement, the level of debate around that. There was no, I think, or you certainly weren't required as an executive committee to make any decision to cancel any mass events, because the inquiry has seen evidence that the organisers cancelled those themselves. Do
Yes,
you
that's
agree?
correct.
And I think, in fact, we've seen reference
With some
to it.
encouragement from ministers as well, particularly in relation to sporting events.
Well, I think the CMO claimed that it was after some encouragement from him.
Perhaps both.
I'm not sure that we've seen much by way of evidence about who encouraged it. What we've seen is a document that refers to the fact that a number of events were either cancelled or ticket sales cancelled without any advice or official advice having been provided. But I think you must agree there's no central decision not to cancel, to cancel, yes?
So I think it will always depend on the nature of the event and who gets. So, for example, some of the events that were cancelled, my lady, were St Patrick's Day events. There were sporting events, and those people that were charged or who had the responsibility, who were organising such events, took that decision to close. And all engaged with the Public Health Agency around their advice just in terms of how they should proceed. But I know that this is something that you are interested in terms of not having one point where everything can be shut down. And I think that comes back to, a comment I made earlier about emergency powers in this type of situation.
Yes, we will come back to that, Ms O'Neill, because I'm sure you do have something to say about, and I am going to take you to the evidence about perhaps the Department of Health operating in a way that made things more difficult for you and Baroness Foster, so I will come to that. Okay. But I think just in terms of understanding how collective responsibility was exercised, I think perhaps it was fortunate that those organisations went ahead and cancelled things themselves, absent any executive committee approach to those type of events.
But we didn't have the legislative powers in which to order closure of certain events, so that isn't a power that was within our gift. And again, I think as the pandemic throws up many of these lessons, that has to be one. You don't have the ability, and different departments have different responsibilities. Local government has responsibilities, private event organisers. So I don't think there's like a very clear-cut answer to the question that you want to try to get to the bottom of, but certainly there should be.
Yes, I think it's on the 5th of March, a paper is circulated about powers to close down mass events. So I think certainly that you would have a power was in contemplation, but I don't think that there had been any collective discussion or consideration before then about what the executive committee could or should do to close down mass events, or even to advise that should be the place that should take place.
Yeah, so I think it was still in the space of the advice of the Public Health Agency at that time and individual engagement, as opposed to any kind of collective approach from memory. But I don't even recall the paper that you're speaking about, but perhaps.
Okay, I think it exists.
Of course,
I'm fairly sure it does. Anyway, just moving on from that, I think the lockdown was announced, and as the inquiry understands it, but perhaps you can confirm, that took place without there having been any discussion between the executive committee about that as something that might happen in the week leading up to it. Is that correct?
So at that point, there wasn't any real evidence, I think, up until perhaps, I'm hazarding a guess here, of around the 18th, before SAGE actually even considered that moving further in terms of restrictions that could potentially be brought in. up until that point, lockdown wasn't anything that was being discussed.
But I don't think, but you will know whether or not this is the case, that there was any discussion between the executive committee in advance of the announcement being made that's what might happen. Is that correct?
I don't recall if that's the case. I know that we were keeping ministers abreast of what was happening in terms of any advice we got, but I think the decision came quick in the end, and it was a matter of then conveying that public message at that time.
And is it right to regard that decision as effectively one that had been made by the UK government rather than by the Executive Committee in Northern Ireland?
And probably, I mean, the executive itself, given the scale of what you were asking of the public, given that you were shutting the doors of businesses, given that you were sending workers home, given all the ramifications that come with making a lockdown decision, the executive did not have the financial ability in which to support people. And therefore, we were very much tied to the approach that was being taken with sage advice, because we needed the Barnett consequentials, so we needed the finances in order to be able to support people, to be able to be compliant. So in the absence of having that kind of support, it probably was virtually impossible without just completely decimating everybody's livelihoods that you could have moved without having that assurance. So that was why we were making that case for those Barnett consequentials, and that allowed us the freedom in which to then move forward.
I don't think that the Chief Medical Officer of Northern Ireland was advising a lockdown prior to the announcement.
No.
I think that decision crystallised on the day of the announcement. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding.
As well.
Yeah.
So I think, and I'm not going to retread water about planning, but it would appear then that there was a very, very short space of time within which ministers in Northern Ireland knew that, in fact, a lockdown was on the way and was going to happen. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, I think, of course, everybody realised that things were deteriorating, and of course, everybody realised the kind of scale of public opinion and panic, just in terms of people being afraid. So, probably taken by surprise, executive colleagues, in terms of the scale of lockdown, but we're also privy to conversations around potential interventions.
All right. I'm going to finish off on this, if I may, with another. It's a message from Sir David Sterling, and again, the inquiry, I think, has seen this. It's INQ 000 309 200. It's an email from him, and I think it may be. It may possibly be on the next page. I think it says, though, that must have been on the other page. Thank you. If we could just go back up to Sir David's. Thank you. It's the third bullet point. It was a point that was put to him, Miss O'Neill, that he had said that ministers had not shown strong leadership and had been too quick to retreat into campaigning or community activist mode. They've gotten away with this partly because UK government has thrown so much money at mitigation. They haven't had to take difficult decisions. Yet when they have, for example, school closure and defining essential businesses, they have been found wanting. The irritation of the minor parties is likely to increase. Do you accept that as a characterisation of the leadership that had been, and the standard of government that had been brought to bear in Northern Ireland until the end of March?
No, I don't. Once again, I don't agree with the Hawks assessment. I think that, as I referred to earlier, ministers were completely in the maelstrom of the pandemic, weeks into being back around the executive table, dealing with all the overhang of the issues which we've already referred to in terms of the backdrop and no institutions for 3 years and the state of preparedness and austerity and all the other things that we referred to previously. Ministers were faced with hard decisions, and it quite frankly, is a bit rich for the head of the civil service to speak in that way whenever ministers were very clear that people's whole lives were about to be disrupted, and particularly in terms of like shutting down society, shutting down businesses, people losing their jobs. How did you go out and convince people that that was the thing to do with no mitigation whatsoever? So the reality of our political situation here and the reality of our financial situation is that we are tied under a funding arrangement with how we get monies through the Barnett formula, through the Treasury. And without that sufficient funding, you couldn't, it was really, really difficult to be able to advance these decisions. We knew that we needed to get here, but without the proper funding in order to do so, we don't have tax raising powers here. We don't have the ability to leverage in additional funding. What we needed was support to do the right thing, and that's what transpired. So closing schools was not easy. Closing businesses was certainly not easy. For all the reasons that everybody would understand, ministers are part of the community. Ministers had families. Ministers had the same worries and stresses that everybody else had, and understood so acutely our local community and what their needs were. And I believe that their constant rock and a hard place decisions that they had to take, all those things weighed heavy on their minds. So that's really what I'd offer in terms of that commentary. I think it was not easy, but we were determined to try and do our best.
Do you accept the point he's making that you effectively didn't really have to make the difficult decisions, that they were effectively made for you?
No, I think that's a cop-out, to be quite blunt about it. How could we have went out and convinced the public that we needed them to do these severe measures of retreating to their homes and closing their businesses and not going to work every day and don't send your children to school? How could we have asked people to do that whole array of things without being able to support them financially? It probably would have been really, really difficult for a lot of people, just for pure survival reasons. They wouldn't have been able to comply. So we couldn't make the decisions because of our fiscal arrangement, because of the jurisdictional issues. We couldn't make these decisions without having that financial backup. So no, that is not something that I recognise.
All right. I'm going to move on, but before that can come down, thank you. The inquiry has heard that throughout this period, and I'm just focusing, if I may, on the ethos or the culture of the executive committee. And it's apparent in the notes that almost every meeting refers to there being leaks, either, and this is what the inquiry has heard, either the options to be discussed were leaked to the media beforehand, and the suggestion was that was in order to kind of inflame debate or to try and condition a media response to it. There's reference to meetings themselves being tweeted, so no confidentiality in the meetings. And then I think we also see reference to papers actually being leaked to the media as well. And I think, again, I think what's very difficult to understand is why collectively ministers allowed that to endure throughout, it would appear, almost the entire period that the inquiry is looking at. That's the first question. And second, why in the context of this most sensitive and pressing of issues going, as we've said, right to the most solemn obligation that politicians owe to their communities, why that endured?
Why leaks endured?
Yes.
I can't answer that question, but I can say it was a deep sense of frustration for both myself and Arlene whenever it came to chairing executive meetings, that they ended up being rehearsed on the media before we even had a chance to take papers into the room for discussion. I certainly did not have any practice whatsoever of leaking documents, but we frequently would have read reports of an ongoing meeting on social media whilst we were discussing things. And I think we tried at one stage to get to the bottom of this. I think there was a Department of Finance look, deep dive to try to see if they could get to the bottom of this. I don't think we were successful at that time. The problem is we were moving from in-person meetings to online meetings. At one stage, and I realised this at one juncture because of the very frustration around leaks, at one stage we probably had about 40 people on the executive meeting. You know, a range of officials across different departments, ministers, special advisors, support staff. And in part, I think that added also till just so many people with their hands on the information, and then some of it was finding its way out. So I don't know where it came from, but it shouldn't have happened, and it did make our job more difficult the whole way through.
Was it particular to this period of time? Was it particular to the response to the pandemic, or is it endemic in the way that the executive committee runs ordinarily?
So we hadn't been sitting for 3 years, so I don't recall previous executives just how, if it was endemic. I don't think so. I would imagine that different times there perhaps was things that found their way into the public space, but at difficult times during the pandemic, a lot of information seemed to find its way into the public, which really just didn't help us to be able to arrive at a good position, and also find consensus on positions, particularly if, because things were in the public space and parties or ministers were being asked to comment on different views of different things, and then it just made things more complicated, more difficult.
Was there not a point in time when ministers sat down to discuss this and to have a frank conversation about the fact that it must have been damaging to everybody sat round that table or virtual table, that they just couldn't come to a meeting and be confident that what they said wouldn't go any further?
There was. I mean, I think myself and Arlene went to great pains to try to advise people, to encourage them not to be engaged in leaking, that this was making all of our jobs more difficult, that it was forcing people into taking positions before they were properly, interrogated or considered further. So it was a huge challenge for us, for sure, and it did endure. I think at different times it was more pronounced than others, and not maybe because of just different issues at different times. And I think particularly as we got towards the end of the pandemic, when you had sort of a more of an anti-COVID sort of sentiment building up in society, all this stuff kind of fueled that kind of noise, and it really wasn't helpful.
Well, I think what the inquiry has seen is perhaps during the most difficult period in terms of the executive committee's functioning. So in the autumn of 2020, there does seem to be a lot of reference at that point. And I think it does appear that the most difficult meeting that you had, the 4-day meeting, was being live tweeted whilst it was happening. And
we were trying to manage our way through that, and it was very difficult and very complex. And I think at one stage, I chaired the whole meeting, and I think Arlene referenced that this is being played out in social media as we speak. That just made a bad situation worse in terms of us trying to navigate our way through it.
I also wanted to go back to an issue that you had raised. And
sorry, if you're leaking.
Sorry.
Yeah, there's just. It's obviously pernicious and makes the life of someone in your position extremely difficult. Have you given any thought as to how you could stop it, or is that an impossible question to answer?
Well, one way we tried to stop it during the pandemic was to reduce the number of people that were in the room for the decision, so that there was, a safe space in which ministers could air their views and have a conversation in confidence. I think that helped a bit, but that autumn period was particularly difficult. And going forward, executive meetings in person again puts people in the room. It's only ministers. You can control who has the information. That's a much better scenario in which to work and control leaks than to have the online version where it can be lost beyond your control because, for example, if you could be sitting behind a screen, who else is in the room, who's privy to the conversation? I think that was something that we realised during the online meetings.
And you could ban personal devices if you wanted to?
In an in-person meeting, of course, yeah.
And it's obviously a breach of the ministerial code where you're meant to behave with the highest standard of propriety. Well, there's no way leaking confidential information is maintaining the highest standards. So
I agree with that.
thank you.
Ms O'Neill, I said that I would take you back to something that you raised, and I think hopefully you've been provided with the document over the lunchtime adjournment so that I can ask you about this, and it links to another topic that I also wanted to ask you questions about. And perhaps if we bring this document on screen, it's INQ 0000309 229. And I think, Miss O'Neill, this referred back to a point you made earlier about the role of the Department of Health at this early stage. And I think we touched upon the fact that the Chief Medical Officer had become involved in correspondence from the Cabinet Office about the response. And I think that was something that you wanted to refer to. But in this document, I think the email that we see on the first page is linked to that, because I think that you had raised an issue about travel to Italy at that time. So I'm trying to put all of this in context for you. So I think that there are probably a couple of different strands in this email. So first of all, the Department of Health and the response to the Cabinet Office is the first one. And then I think the second one is the suggestion or the concern that you might appear at odds with the Chief Medical Officer. And I think that that's what you had wanted to refer to earlier in your evidence. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity to answer that, or to give the evidence that.
Well, I just think that's reflective of the pushback. So I think, and I don't recall, obviously this exchange, I wasn't copied into it, but the situation was rapidly unfolding in Italy. As far as I remember, there was advice sought in terms of a school trip.
Yes.
And I think I questioned whether or not that should be allowed to continue. But again, I clearly was pushed back on that. I'm only can assume that's what that reference refers to.
And was there any concern on your part, or the part of Baroness Foster, or a joint concern about the role of the Chief Medical Officer and the extent, I suppose, of your dependence on one principal person for medical or scientific advice during this period? And I don't want to put that too simply, because I know that the Chief Scientific Advisor also provided advice after March. But sorry, coming back to that primary question about, and maybe it goes a little bit further, whether you had concerns about whether or not you had sufficient access to a breadth of advice.
Yeah, I think we both would say that. I mean, we were very reliant on the Chief Medical Officer. And let me say again, a very, very extremely challenging job to do throughout the pandemic. For everybody in health, not least CMO and the Health Minister, I think that we felt that we had a lack of our own, to the Executive Office, advice. So you had CMO, which sits probably neatly in one sense within the Department of Health, and they have their own autonomy, and CMO's answerable to the Minister of the day. But was very clear in terms of the Chief Scientific Advice, which became the modelling and the other information that we received. I think we agreed, or I know we agreed that we should have had our own Chief Scientific Advisor in place for the Executive. I'm glad to say that we've actually since recruited for that position. That was an early lesson learned for us in terms of what we need in terms of the administration itself. I think that person is due to start in the coming days. So that, I think, underlines that we did feel that we needed additional advice and expertise in terms of dealing with the gravity of the situation that we had.
So I think that deals with the Chief Scientific Advisor. We know that the Chief Medical Officer was part of the Department of Health. He was advisor to it and a member of the senior management team. Did you perceive any difficulty in terms of his being or having that role or that lack of independence in terms of the provision of advice to you?
I think it's fair to say that I did at times, because it's the advice that comes. It felt at times that the Chief Medical Officer was, and again, probably for the right reasons, trying to keep the lead of the response, and even that cabinet exchange around things must be cleared by himself, no papers to come to the Executive Office unless they were cleared by himself. There was a general kind of sense of that perhaps too much responsibility is vested in that one area, whereas it's his job, or any Chief Medical Officer's job, to advise and for ministers to decide.
In the autumn, when relations amongst the Executive Committee were more difficult, do you think at that point in time it might have helped to have had someone who was independent and providing advice to the Executive Committee, as opposed to being the advisor to the Department of Health?
I think the problems that we faced in the autumn, and I did get to hear some of Minister Poots's evidence, where he stated that the DUP had taken a certain position in the autumn time, that they wanted to put a mark down, that they were approaching that run of meetings that were quite difficult with a particular strategy in mind. Could an independent voice in the middle of that have helped? Sure, it wouldn't have done any harm, of course, but I think that the problems that we faced, unfortunately, at that time were due to just a particular approach that they had decided to take, and at that stage of the pandemic.
We'll come back and deal with what happened in the autumn in a little bit more detail. I think that the counterpart to that, or the counter argument, or the evidence that's been given about that, is that those individuals who thought that there needed to be a more nuanced debate around impact on the indirect impacts on health and the impact on economy didn't feel that there was sufficient space to have that debate within the Executive Committee. And I think maybe this was a point that Lord Peter Ware made, that the sense that the Department of Health wielded too much power in those meetings. I think that's the counter argument to that. Do you have sympathy with that viewpoint on their part? Or do you sympathy is probably the wrong word. Do you understand why they might have had that perception?
I understand that we had difficult choices to make in terms of trying to strike the right balance at that stage of the pandemic, where we're at, what we're facing. I think, in that autumn period in particular, and I don't want to use the wrong quote, but I think the Chief Medical Officer said it was the gravest he'd seen it at that time.
I think he said on the 8th of October that he was never more concerned than he had been as the Chief Medical Officer.
Yes, and I think then when you have that weighing on you and you're trying to get the right balance between what's the right health intervention to suppress the virus, at the same time trying to get the balance right between livelihoods, because people were really suffering. Mental health was very prevalent. People were getting it really, really tough. It was a difficult year. People were tired. It just was, I think, a very getting to a kind of a fraught place in general for people who just had been fed up with COVID at that stage in the general public. But I don't think, regardless of what we would have had in place, the fact that that Edwin Poots has said that they deliberately came in with a particular plan to vote against regulations, then that makes it very difficult, regardless of who's trying to chair the meeting or trying to get a consensus view. Look, I think, again, I don't take away from anybody, because I think everybody was trying to get the balance right, and don't think any of us had the perfect the perfect decision point, or could put our hand up and say that was an A-star approach. I think that the difficulty that we had all the time was trying to get that balance. But the gravity of the situation facing us in the autumn was what the Chief Medical Officer had said in October, but then took a few weeks before they came back in terms of asking for more restrictions to be put in place. So I understand where the DUP were coming from, but I also would put it in a bit of context that they're more of a libertarian view. They're not very they don't find favour with intervention, with trying to intervene and bring in the regulations that we were. So I think there was a bit of an ideological approach as well to the meeting.
Okay, I will come back to that meeting, but just for now, I'm just trying to stay on the issue of the Department of Health, and also on the concept of the lead department as well. And obviously we did touch upon that earlier in your evidence. I had wanted first of all to ask you about an email, so I'm going to try and do this over quite a significant period of time and try and bookend it. The inquiry has seen an email of yours that's dated the 26th of March. And sorry, it's not an email from you, it's an email that conveys what you said, that you felt that you needed to be driving the crisis and that you needed to be in control. And I think that when it got to December, and perhaps we can bring this up and bookend it, it's INQ 000 391436. So this is a meeting from the 1st of December 2020. We can see the points that the First Minister was making. And then if we just go to the points that you were making. Thank you. So I think that point, we're left not knowing and left to front things, that might be a theme that can be, or a line that can be drawn from the communications around March until this period of time. So I suppose the first question is whether or not that concern that you weren't being provided with information in a timely enough way, whether that did endure, in fact, until December 2020.
I think it's fair to say yes, because there was frustration at times where we would read on media reports a latest presentation from the Department of Health, and it isn't something that was brought to our attention in advance. So therefore, myself and Arlene would be going out to do media, etc., and you're being asked about things that you're blindsided on, which isn't helpful in terms of trying to communicate. But so I think this is a thread that ran the whole way through, and I think what both herself and myself are reflecting, this is the conversation with Jenny Piper, who became our new interim Hux, was that we needed her help to come in to try to grab this, so that we moved away from the circuit breaker approach and into a more considered, because obviously this evolved the whole way through the pandemic from first iteration to where we were with this piece of work, and it tried to reflect just the change in space. But there were things that were frustrating. Legislation, regulations being brought forward, we would announce them, but then whenever the legislation was brought forward, perhaps had a different meaning, and there were problems just in terms of turning that around in real time. So we were trying to reflect that with Jenny, and I think Jenny also did a good job in terms of coming in and helping us to try to turn this piece of work around.
And I think, is that then what led to the executive task force?
Yes.
As a better model, perhaps, of coordinating what you wanted to do. Thank you, that can come down. I wanted to go back again in time, but not to dwell on it, Miss O'Neill. After the funeral and the meeting that we've seen on the 2nd of July, we understand that relations between you and the First Minister became difficult, and that you stopped doing joint press conferences together. Is that right?
That's right.
And certainly Mr. Swan gave evidence that he regarded that as a really important thing, because before that you had been able to present a united front to the people of Northern Ireland. And I think you do accept from what you said before that obviously your actions had led to damage with your colleagues on the executive committee.
Yes, I accepted that and accept it again today. We had all been working very hard, and it would never be my intention to I would never set out intentionally to try to damage things, but it did damage things, and we did stop doing the joint press conference for a period of time. But I immediately set myself to the work of trying to rebuild that trust and confidence, and I was glad then that we were able to get back into doing joint press again from September.
So it was from September onwards. And there will be questions, obviously. I understand the point you might make, that I think was not your choice, but that the First Minister felt that she couldn't appear on a platform with you.
Yes, that's correct. We had a conversation about that, and that's what the outcome of it was, yeah.
All right. But just moving on from that, and I suppose the other question that arises is whether or not you accept that you may have contributed at that point in time to a loss of confidence on the part of the public in adhering to the regulations.
I think I've said that. I mean, I think that you can't quantify that, but of course people would have had their view, and I've said I was wrong to go, and I accept, that did damage that public confidence. But equally, I would say that I worked really hard to try to gain that back and to build the confidence and the trust, and to lead us for the next year and a half through the pandemic.
Okay, and it's not being suggested that that was the sole factor that contributed to perhaps a tailing off of public adherence to regulations.
No, because I think that if to reverse back a bit, I think that we've reflected on just where we were at that time of the year, after people living with horrific restrictions and what it meant for them, and people were struggling with mental health, people were struggling financially, people were struggling just in general with their world being turned upside down. So I think compliance became more difficult for us in the latter part of that year, particularly as we were going through that more difficult period, and it was clear that we needed to try and intervene to try to reset that. And I think then compliance, I think people understood the severity again of the situation and broadly were more compliant.
At this point in time, there appears to be suggestion that there were concerns about the lack of enforcement on the part of the police. Was that a concern that you had coming into the autumn of 2020?
I think it was an issue that the Department of Justice and Minister Long would have raised, that perhaps thought that whilst obviously in the first instance we all agreed that it was much better to try to take people with us and not go down the enforcement route, but there was a proposal brought forward that we needed to look at the level of fine, and I think some of that work originated in the work that the junior ministers were doing in terms of enforcement as well.
All right. We obviously come then. I won't take you through everything that happened leading up to the difficult meeting that took place in November. But in terms of the factors that contributed to that meeting being so difficult, was one of them that your relations with other members of the executive committee had been damaged and remained damaged?
No, I believe that we're all mature politicians, and I think that we had that period, and in particular, perhaps Arlene and I not doing the joint pressers for that 6-week, I think, or 8-week period. But after that, we came back. I mean, we were back at the executive the week after that. We were back at the executive the whole way through. And I think we did get back in terms of trying to respond to the pandemic and to do our jobs collectively, which I think is fair to say that that's what we try to do.
All right. I'm going to move on then to another topic, if I may. And it's the question of the consideration that was given to equality considerations, particularly at the outset of the pandemic, and the consideration that was given, for example, to disabled people in Northern Ireland and the consequences that lockdown might have. Do you accept that inadequate consideration was given to them, particularly in those early stages, and that there was a lack of understanding as to the implications that lockdown would have for them?
Yes, I think we all have to reflect hard on that, because I think that the speed in which we were trying to take decisions, the fact that we suspended our normal equality impact assessment approach, the fact that we were trying to mitigate as best as we could, but we certainly did not get it all right, and a blanket lockdown is always going to probably hurt the more marginalised even further. So I think this is an area where we have to do huge soul searching. I mean, I listened to the impact statement. I think the lady's name was Joanne, about how she felt like forgotten and left behind. I mean, we wouldn't ever, and she asked actually that we never repeat that again, and that needs to be the learning that we take from how we responded to people with disabilities, minority ethnic groups, people out there in society that were just more vulnerable. I think that even though I think we tried to do some very good work, and I mean, I think nobody could in any way question the community response to the pandemic. The fact that we are just a small kind of unique entity here in terms of everybody knows everybody. The fact that government was able to work with local government, we were able to work with community and voluntary sector, we were able to work with the arts sector, the sporting community. The fact that we were able to turn around food boxes, get them directly out to people, the free school meals issue between education and DFC, some of the economy initiatives. I think we tried to provide mitigation, but it definitely didn't touch everybody, and I think we have to be very cognizant of that and ensure that that is a huge, huge lesson learned.
As you say, in a society which is small and in which people know each other very well, and perhaps politicians like you feel closely connected to their communities and very much part of their communities, it might be thought all the more surprising that there wasn't a greater level of understanding of the needs that people would have at a deeper level than food delivery or children getting free school meals.
I think it goes a lot deeper than that. I mean, I think that I am very, very glad that we had a local administration in place. I'm very glad that we had local ministers who had that local knowledge. And I'm very glad that the initiatives that were brought forward, whether that be some of those that have referred to prescriptions being delivered to people's homes. But I also absolutely accept we didn't and couldn't mitigate against all the impact of the pandemic. And if there's a work stream in terms of what we need to do better, this has to be a priority area that we have to get right. And I listened to some of the Disability Action testimony, and like no minister would think that that is comfortable reading. No minister would accept that that is a good enough space for us to be in. So absolutely, this has to be an area where lessons will be learned.
Of course, one of the constituencies of people who stood to be most affected were older people and people who lived in care homes. You agree?
Yes.
And we saw that at the very outset of the pandemic in January 2020, in the briefing that you were provided with, do you recall we saw that? It said yes, that older people and those who already had conditions stood to be disproportionately affected. The inquiry's also seen the guidance that was given by the Department of Health, perhaps particularly in the planning document for mid-March to mid-April, that provided guidance about freeing up, and I'm putting this in my words rather than the technical language that was used, freeing up hospital space by utilising capacity within the care sector. Were you, first of all, did you know at the time that was the guidance or the position being adopted by the Department of Health?
In terms of that document that was published, I'm not sure. I know that the inquiry is going to look in some detail around care homes, and I think this is, again, one of those areas that we must reflect on. I know that I was concerned from very early on in terms of the discharge of people from hospital without being tested, and raised these issues, and I think perhaps that is reflected in executive meetings. I don't think, again, it's a deep source of pain for all those families that were impacted by the care home situation, not least not being able to get access to visit their loved ones. I had raised consistently the issue of testing. The WHO advice, the ECDC advice was test. And I felt that wasn't being done in the way in which it should have been, particularly in those early days. I think that eventually there was, it got to a point where it was much improved, but in those early days, it certainly wasn't. And I know that the inquiry's asked me just to comment briefly as part of the statement, but I'm absolutely willing to participate in more detail in terms of the care home issue and further modules, because I think that we have to get to the bottom of this, and this is one of those things, again, that needs to be got right if we ever, when we find ourselves in this position again, because inevitably we will.
Yes. I think in terms of the testing, though, and for example, the capacity of organisations like the PHA, we know that there wasn't the capacity to scale up testing. The inquiry has heard that, and that the PHA had limited people to engage in tracing. But again, those weren't issues over which anyone or the executive committee was exercising any form of collective scrutiny in those months of February and March. We've seen that, haven't we?
Well, yeah, I would say, again, operational responsibility for care homes absolutely fell within the Department of Health, and therefore that's why you see the plans coming from the Department of Health. But I can categorically say that within executive meetings, repeatedly, executive ministers were raising not just the issue of testing, PPE for staff, testing for staff. We were also offering up that there were community solutions to testing, that there were community and voluntary groups out there that were willing to participate and help the PHA. And we were encouraging the PHA to take that approach. Unfortunately, this is an area that certainly in those early days was absolutely not fit for purpose and did not serve those residents of care homes well.
I think I'm just going to unpick a few bits of that. I think that the raising of concerns about care homes, it comes a bit later, doesn't it? I think that we start to see concerns being raised about care homes. I think probably, and I can check this, but I think that from maybe around April time, concerns start to be raised.
Yes, because at that time, again, the situation's still rapidly deteriorating, but the Department of Health have operational responsibility in terms of care homes, and again, the legislative provisions, it's not for us to overreach in terms of their remit. However, we didn't accept that, and I think it's fair to say that I think the minutes will reflect probably every minister was raising this issue as something that we need to get ahead of, and that it wasn't good enough in those early days, and I think we all will accept that even now in terms of collective responsibility again.
I think from the underlying documents that we've seen in terms of testing for people, just focusing on testing for people coming out of hospital, that certainly in and around the 18th of April, and I think it was announced on the 19th of April, that it was then that all discharges to care homes, so all individuals being discharged to care homes should be tested for COVID-19. So, I mean, that's obviously it's a long way down the line, isn't it?
But you can see throughout all of the minutes the whole way through from that I have consistently raised the issue of why aren't we just testing everybody, not just symptomatic or asymptomatic? Why are we not just blanket testing? Because I was concerned. As soon as these issues were brought to my attention, that was whenever I was constantly raising them, and they were brought to our attention by families, by loved ones, by people who work in the care home sector. And as I said, I think nobody can say anything other than this initial response to care homes wasn't good enough.
Because it was being raised, but I think the answer was because we don't have capacity. Is that right?
Yeah, but I didn't accept that because I felt that there were other ways in which the capacity could have been achieved, because we had people who were volunteering to come forward and staff testing centres and do things to assist in the pandemic. And I think, unfortunately, that wasn't taken up. But I can't speak for PHA's thinking as to why they didn't take that up. But they clearly articulate staffing as a problem. There's no doubt the system was stretched, but these were the most vulnerable people, and it should have been better.
I'm not sure that it was a question of staffing being stretched at this stage. It would appear, but you may know differently, that the issue was there wasn't testing capacity rather than having people to go and administer staff. Is that your understanding? That
Probably, I think it was both. It was being articulated at the time.
And I think, in fact, it's correct that in terms of testing for asymptomatic people, I think that testing every 2 weeks wasn't introduced until about August 2020. Does that accord with your understanding as well?
I don't recall the exact date, but I know that it came later, yes.
All right. But again, you accept that that's far too late in the piece.
As I was saying from day one, test, trace and isolate. These were the advice that we were being given. And that didn't happen in the department.
And do you regard that again as being a failure of collective responsibility, that the infrastructure wasn't in place or that the plans hadn't been made in order to ensure that...
I'm not trying to distance ourselves from this issue, because I think really what the public need to hear is that we're going to do better and that we're going to, arrest and make sure that this never happens again. But operational responsibility for this issue fell within the department, just as operational responsibility for responding to communities fell within the Department of Communities, or operational responsibility for schools legislatively fell within those remits. But that being said, I think we should all not be too guarded about accepting that care homes could have been better, and we need to learn that lesson.
Can I just ask about that? So if it's clear, or if the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister have a concern that a critical aspect of a response to a pandemic isn't being delivered and people's lives are being put at risk, are you suggesting that there isn't really anything that they can do about that apart from asking about it in the Executive Committee?
Trying to influence it. I'm just articulating the legislative position that you can't direct another minister from another party. Again, it goes back to our unique system of governance. You can't direct, as First and Deputy First, another minister to do a certain thing that's within their operational responsibility. You can try to influence, which is usually how these things happen, but I'm just setting out that's the legislative position within the department.
Right. I'm going to deal with a separate issue then, and that relates to informal communications. Miss O'Neill. I think you deal with this in your statement, but I think just to be clear about it, I think that you accept that you cleansed or wiped your devices when the power sharing arrangements came to an end. Is that right?
That's right.
So did you delete them in and around February? I think it was February 2022, or was it later than that?
Yeah, I'm assuming whenever I left office, yes.
All right. And I also think it's correct that if we look, for example, at the messages between you and Baroness Foster, that it's right that those messages do discuss substantive matters about the response to the pandemic.
No messages ever. There may have been a to and fro in a conversation outside of a meeting, but the official record was the official record in terms of decisions made. and I was confident that any decision making that Arlene and I couldn't decide on a message to decide to do something. We would have to bring it to the executive. So all decisions were recorded on the official record in terms of what the civil service hold, and that was a requisite of even the RHI inquiry, where all records must be kept, notes of meetings, everything must be recorded.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not just decisions that have to be recorded, though, is it? It is discussions around them. There are rules, aren't there? There's guidance about what should be retained and committed to the official record. Yes?
Well, yes, but I'm confident that all decisions, and because we would have maybe had an initial conversation, but that didn't prohibit a conversation in an official capacity with officials. So I'm confident that all those decisions were recorded. I have been a Minister for Health. I've been a Minister for Agriculture and Rural Affairs. And I noted other ministers, Minister Long, had the same approach as I in terms of clearing your device because of sensitive information before you hand it back to the department, because it's going to be redistributed to another member of staff. And that was the process from which we had in previous departments as well. So that would be why that approach was taken.
I just want to check your witness statement.
Sure.
I think what you say, so I'm referring to your statement of March 2024. I think if we look at paragraph 396, and perhaps if that could be brought up on screen, it's INQ 000 436 641. What you say in your statement is, I would occasionally have used WhatsApp, text messages and iMessages to communicate about logistical or administrative matters. This would have included confirming availability or changing timings for meetings, or notifications about papers that had been emailed or were cleared. I did not use WhatsApp, text messages or iMessages to communicate about matters related to the response to the pandemic, other than logistical and administrative matters. So you weren't in your witness statement confining that to decisions that were made, were you?
Probably just in terms of how excuse me, how I read that. I can see, given that message that you've just referred to, how that would be taken that way. I can just say that I was assured that the official record was being recorded, and I know that any exchanges that I have on any of the devices are with the official system through all the private office staff, and I think they've all been shared with the inquiry. So I think that everything that was exchanged with me from anybody in the department, the civil service, should all be on the public record.
Sorry, I want to be clear and I want to be fair about this. I mean, you are quite clear in your statement, aren't you, about saying that you would only use, or that you would occasionally have used WhatsApp to communicate about logistical and administrative matters, correct?
Yes.
And you appear to repeat that. Is that correct or not?
I think it's fair to say, given what we're talking about, it not use these platforms for any policy, financial or political discussion of a response to COVID. When I make that statement, I'm referring to being of the understanding that everything is recorded in terms of decisions on the official record, but I'm happy to correct that if you think that that's appropriate.
Well, I mean, if we look, and we've looked at some of the messages between you and Baroness Foster, but if we look, I mean, we can look at it again, INQ 000 400 592. And perhaps if we go to page 5 of that. I think we can see a discussion about, I think this is the Minister for Finance. It's reference to Connor. And references to rates papers.
Mm-hmm.
And if we scroll down, please. And perhaps we can maybe just go to page 10. Oh, sorry, so we can see there, if we look at the 22nd of May, 22nd of May 2020, Baroness Foster's asking you about your views about the quarantine fine. I think it should be £1,000. £60 will be derisory. And I think page 17. If we could just scroll down, please. I think again we can see Baroness Foster asking you for your view on Portugal. If we just carry on down, please. Yeah, so I think that just provides some examples, Miss O'Neill, of the kind of discussions that you were having with Baroness Foster, yes?
Yes.
And these are certainly not just administrative matters, are they, or fixing dates for meetings?
No, you're right. They are an exchange around issues, but they will not be the formal record of any decision that will be made. That will come to the executive.
The duty to record isn't just confined to a formal record, is it?
Well, I can accept that on reflection, I don't have these messages, so I couldn't, when I looked, I didn't have anything like this to give you, so, and I hadn't read this until now, but I can reflect that even though I understood that to be the way in which to do things in terms of my previous experience as a minister, obviously it'd be much more fulsome if I had that, these same records to give to you, and I can correct my statement.
Just focusing, first of all, on the fact that you're having substantive, or you're certainly discussing business issues, if I can put it like that, by WhatsApp, aren't you?
Sorry, say that again?
You're certainly discussing business issues. I'm calling them business to just cover the range of government topics that you're discussing with Baroness Foster, yes?
Yes.
And I think we can agree that this isn't just about meeting or administration. Do you agree?
Yes, I do agree.
And do you also agree that the duty to record information, the duty on you as a minister, isn't just about the formal record, so to speak, or recording decisions? Yes?
Yes.
You have
But I think I worked on the basis that all official decisions will be recorded, but I absolutely can hear or listen to what you're saying in terms of developing a conversation that eventually ended up in an official executive decision.
I'm just trying to, I think, understand what you understand your duties were to record information and to ensure that it's committed to the official record. So do you accept that there's a duty to commit official discussions about business matters to the record?
Yes, I do.
And do you accept that this sort of discussion is the sort of thing that has it's moved into the territory of a government business discussion, and that it ought to form part of the formal record?
Yes, I do.
So putting that to one side, Miss O'Neill, because that's a separate issue from the question of this inquiry and the duties that were owed to this inquiry. You were informed, weren't you, by Miss Brady about your obligations to the inquiry and to ensure that all evidence and information for it was retained?
I don't recall the conversation, but I have read the submission that came up, so clearly I must have received it.
So is that the submission? I think it's dated the 21st of November 2021.
That's right.
So you accept that she provided you with guidance about your duties in respect of this inquiry and what ought to be retained for it?
Yeah, I can only accept that I did receive that communication. I don't recall it, but I can only accept that I did.
And do you also accept that she provided with it the legal guidance that had been generated by the Departmental Solicitor's Office?
No, I can't recall seeing that.
Are you aware, though, that she attached it to that submission?
I'm aware from reading that submission that it was, but I don't recall seeing it.
And would you have read that at the time?
I'm assuming anything that's put in front of me that I will, of course I will read it, but I just don't recall it.
That guidance, the legal guidance, gave an instruction about the retention of material for the inquiry, and it included, I can take you to it if
No, it's okay, I take your word.
If you want to. It included the instruction that informal communications would fall within the material that might have to be disclosed to the inquiry. Yes?
Yes.
And have you seen that, Miss O'Neill?
This guidance?
Yes.
Yes.
Have you seen the guidance? So do you accept that the guidance is quite clear that that's what you ought to have done?
Yeah, but I think also in that document it talks about the official record and how it would be recorded, and I can accept that that I wrongly was working on the assumption that everything that is recorded through the system would be officially on the official record. But on hindsight, absolutely, of course, those exchanges are talking much more than logistics, so I can accept that.
But the legal guidance that was generated was quite clear, wasn't it? That information or that WhatsApps might fall within the material that had to be disclosed to the inquiry. Yes?
Yeah, yes, okay, yes. I think, as I said, I don't recall reading that advice. I do remember from reading the submission that it talked about the official record and how everything was being recorded. I remember conversations about all of that. But I accept that I should have kept my additional exchanges with, in particular with Arling, and anything else that was relevant.
Well, you were duty bound, weren't you?
Sure.
To retain all information, regardless of format, that might be potentially relevant to the inquiry.
And I thought that I did, but clearly I didn't.
And it's not just about messages with Baroness Foster, is it? I mean, you deleted all of your devices, as I understand it, that you had. Yes?
Yes, my personal phone, which I would do frequently in terms of just the level of sensitive information that I would have on my phone.
So this wasn't you weren't discriminating. You weren't
Absolutely
thinking, I'll delete some of that and I'll keep that. It was your entire device, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely not. And would reset my phone regularly, just in terms of security and not leaving my phone down somewhere with anything sensitive in relation to it. So that's something that I would do routinely on an ongoing basis and have done since probably coming into elected office, particularly at a higher government level.
So given the clarity of advice that was provided by the Departmental Solicitor's Office, why did you reset your device after it had been given?
Again, I was working on the basis that everything that was held in the central record was disclosing everything that I was engaged in terms of any correspondence. So I thought the official record held every piece of communication. As I said, I'm aware that every piece of communication with any department official, head of civil service, even Arlene, from what she was able to provide, I worked on the basis that everything was in the system. Clearly, that's not how it's transpired.
Did you regularly analyse or go through your WhatsApp messages to work out what should be committed to the record before you deleted your devices?
But I worked on the department phone, and in my own phone would be just on rare occasions as opposed to anything on an ongoing way.
Sorry, let me just be clear about this. These messages or these WhatsApps that you exchanged with Baroness Foster, are they on your personal phone or your business phone?
You see, I don't know because I didn't have those exchanges, so I'm not sure. I'm assuming my department phone.
We can check. We've assumed that it's your departmental
Yeah,
phone.
I
but
can only
if there's
assume
any
that would be
doubt about
I
that.
think that was how we communicated.
But in terms of your wiping your device, what I'm trying to understand is whether before you would periodically do that, as you've suggested, whether you would go through any exercise of checking whether or not there's something that you should commit to the official record before you wiped it.
I think all of this has become more crystal clear in the event of the RHI report, and we all now know that that is how we conduct ourselves. If I had a meeting in the hallway with someone now, I would have to tell my official about it, and it would have to be written down and commended to the official record. As far as the pandemic period is concerned, I was working on the basis that I had committed everything that needed to the inquiry. I don't have the personal phone, but I think every other exchange in terms of with the civil service itself is there for the inquiry to see.
Just to be clear about this, that's because some people who worked with you still had their devices intact, correct?
Well, they're the official holder of the information, as in the civil servants.
Yes, but what I mean is we haven't got anything from your phone because it was wiped, yes?
Yes, but as per what I understood to be the practice, as did Minister Long from being in previous departments, that a minister's phone would be reset in return.
Yes, but I think just coming back to the point and what you understood your duties to be, first of all, I think the RHI report was published at some stage in 2020, correct?
We were just actually trying to work our way through the recommendations of it when we came back into office.
Yes, so in 2020,
January, yeah.
We're discussing February 2022, and added to whatever the RHI said, you had been given clear advice that you should be retaining WhatsApps, yes?
Yes, but I believe I've misunderstood exactly what I should retain and thought I had retained everything that that was relevant to the COVID decision-making process.
My lady, I have been given a note to say that we are going to break at 3:05.
We were meant to be breaking it. Oh yes, of course it's 10:02 we started. Yes. Do you want to go? How much longer have you got on this topic?
I think it's almost finished. But if you would, sorry, I had understood that there was an imperative to finish. But if there isn't, that's fine.
No, just I think Mr. Scott being careful. Probably best if you don't mind. I'm sorry, we're going to have to break again, but we need to ensure the stenographer has proper break. So even if we are mid-topic, it's probably, as we've now broken,
Yes,
I'll come back at past.
Okay.
Thank you,
Stop it.
lady. So, Miss O'Neill, just before that short adjournment, I think that you had accepted that, first of all, you knew about this inquiry, yes. You'd been provided with a ministerial submission on the need to retain information for it. And you'd also been provided with legal guidance that pointed out the need to, or that WhatsApp material or informal communications was also the sorts of material that needed to be retained for the inquiry, yes?
Yes, yeah.
But nonetheless, you went ahead and you wiped, I think, your own devices. Is that correct?
Yes.
So you didn't return them to your office, your private office, so that they could return them to IT Assist.
No, as I explained, I did.
Actually did it yourself.
Yeah.
And can you just explain why, in light of everything that you knew, you went ahead and did that? In other words, notwithstanding all of the instructions that you had been given.
I think two things. I think, firstly, I wiped the device, as Minister Long explained, because we thought that was our custom and practice in terms of departmental phones being returned. Secondly, that I believed that the official record was recorded and populated. And thirdly, clearly a misunderstanding on my part in terms of like informal communication and what actually that meant. But by and large, I'm satisfied that the vast majority of everything that I communicated was on the device and hopefully on the official record, but I can say that my understanding of the WhatsApp and informal communication is not as where it should have been.
You might be satisfied of that, Miss O'Neill, but this inquiry doesn't have the chance to be satisfied about what's contained on your device, does it?
Yeah, sorry, I meant I was satisfied. I thought that the record was recorded, but absolutely I take the point about the inquiry not being satisfied, that I don't have that additionality to bring to what is already on the record.
And you must have understood from the advice that you were given that the inquiry foresaw and understood that there might be value in having informal communications retained for the purposes of its work.
And again, I can only say that I didn't use that device in the main for anything other than just if, for example, I was online and I needed to make arrangements or things like that. But by and large, I was of the view that I didn't have anything on those devices that would have been for the inquiry. I thought that was all in the official record, but with hindsight, I reflect on that.
And we only have your word to go on about that, really, don't we?
I accept that, yeah.
And we've already seen that your witness statement is wrong insofar as it suggests that you only used your devices for the purposes of administration. Yes.
Yes, and just for the record, not to be deliberately misleading, but clearly my understanding of what I was writing in the statement, but I can correct that.
Yeah, it's not really that you can correct it, Miss O'Neill, it's that you made a witness statement to this inquiry saying that you used your devices for the purposes of administration, when it's quite clear that that was not correct.
That was my understanding, that was in the main how I used that device.
My lady, I'm going to move on if I may.
Yes, please. Thank you.
I wanted to go back to the meeting that took place on the 9th of November, the meeting that went on for a period of 4 days. And I wanted to ask, if I may, Miss O'Neill, whether you considered that the deployment of the cross-community vote during it was damaging to the executive committee itself, first of all, and then to ask you whether or not you thought that it was damaging to public confidence as well. But if I could ask you the first point, please.
Yes, I believe it was. The cross-community provision is in order to protect minorities when what we were discussing in terms of decision making at the executive was in relation to regulations that impacted across wider society. So it was wholly inappropriate to use a cross-community mechanism as a blocking mechanism in the executive. There have been other times, of course, when votes were taken, but on a straight bat.
Yes.
And that should have been how business was conducted at this time.
Can I just ask you, I think we can look, for example, at the vote that was taken about schools. I think it's correct that that wasn't taken on a cross-community basis, was it?
No, that's correct. It was taken on a straight bat vote and stack up the numbers on either side of the question.
Yes. And in terms of damage that may have been done owing to the deployment of the cross-community vote, do you think that that continued to impact upon the executive after that 4-day meeting took place?
I think that it was a really challenging time for us. A meeting that, by anybody's imagination, that goes on for 4 days long is going to be very taxing. It was very clear from the medical advice that we were being given that this intervention was necessary, and it's also equally clear, as I said earlier, that there was an intention on the part of DUP ministers to come in to mark cards, as they described it, and to veto the advice. That's unfortunate, and it was not a good moment in time for the whole of the executive, and particularly given just the scale of the problems that we had again at that time and the virus transmission, etc. But like all of these junctures, we're able to come back from these things and get on with doing our job and working through the issues, which we did throughout the days ahead, albeit that some ministers mightn't have been happy with the outcome and the outworking of it and expressed that in a public way. But outside of that, I think we just got on with continuing to work our way through it as best we could. And I think at this juncture is where Jenny Piper's work becomes even more important in terms of trying to bring that all together again.
And what about the damage that was done to public confidence by calling a cross-community vote? And of course, it's understood you weren't the person calling for it, of course. Do you consider that it had a broader impact beyond the confines of the Executive Committee?
I think given that where we were at the end of that very difficult year, where we were with transmission rates, where we were with this, growing nearly anti-COVID, even thinking in relation to vaccinations and kind of the kind of anti-sentiment that came, that kind of started to really rise at that time. It was unhelpful because it fueled a lot of that kind of noise. There's no stretch of any imagination that would articulate that it's the right thing to do to deploy a cross-community vote for public health advice. And I think that's the part that public couldn't understand. And so it was another very, very difficult time in the pandemic response.
And was part of the damage also the fact that, again, well, we've already heard, because that meeting was effectively being broadcast, as it were, via tweets, that the public knew that these were issues about which ministers were divided and didn't have a common position?
Yes, I think very much there was an attempt to paint a picture from some ministerial colleagues that it was health versus the economy, health versus people's mental health, health versus all the other societal impacts of the pandemic. And that clearly wasn't the case, because we were trying to get the balance in all of those things. As I said earlier, none of us can stand over that it was always the perfect balance, but we did strive to get a good balance. So I think for all of those reasons, it was extremely unhelpful, and it then prolonged that meeting itself, that we had to keep adjourning, to keep coming back. You can see for 4 days there's an attempt to try to get consensus, there's an attempt to try to move to that point, but the medical advice is the medical advice, and then you have to interrogate it and then make a decision. Some people in the executive have chosen to take one direction, and the rest of us, all bar one party, would have supported what was being brought forward from health as a necessary even intervention at that time. But unfortunately, we couldn't achieve that, and then it meant we had a stop-start,
Yes.
Approach, which wasn't helpful either.
That's what I wanted to ask you about, because I think perhaps this isn't something that's entirely clear, and it may help to spell it out slightly what then happened. I think as the inquiry understands it, there was a decision at the end of that meeting to extend the restrictions. I think it was by 2 weeks. But I think it's right that they then lapsed in and around the 29th of November, so that there was a week when non-essential retail opened, and I think cafes opened as well. Is that right?
Yeah, it was ludicrous, to be quite frank, in terms of an approach. The regs fell off the face of the earth if we didn't vote to extend them. So we had that very difficult period in between where some things opened up, some didn't. But then we had to regroup and come back at it again.
And I think, again, just to try and understand what happened, there was that period of 1 week. Then I think a further circuit breaker, so to speak, for a 2-week period.
Yes.
But did that then fall away at the end of those 2 weeks as well? It appears to have.
That would have brought us into November.
It would have taken to the 13th of December.
Yes. I think that I would have to double check that to be sure. I wouldn't want to give you the wrong information, but it was 6 weeks was proposed. We agreed 4, then we had an extra 2, and then they needed some more. Obviously, or we had the period at the end of December, and then early January we were back at it again.
I don't want to lead you into error. I think
I don't want
that they fell away on the 13th of December, but that's obviously something that can be checked. But in terms of that start and stop, it's the 2 weeks, then the week of opening, then the 2 weeks. Yes.
Yes.
And then I think you were straight into then having to deal with the challenges of what to do about decision making around Christmas, correct?
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
And I think in the context of difficult advice about the the pressures that the health system was being put under at that time. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And I think the inquiry's also seen that that week, whenever restrictions fell away at the start of December, 23rd of November for a week, there's certainly evidence in the papers that were provided to the executive committee that was contributing to an infection rate increase, I think of about 25%. Is that?
I don't recall that exact figure, but I know it was said at the time that the opening would have definitely contributed to the already difficult situation.
And I think that it's around this time that you didn't want to commit to a four-nation statement committing to arrangements over Christmas as well. Is that right?
I think just because we had differences of approach or difference of emphasis, for no other reason other than it just didn't work. And I can't even recall, if I'm honest, the exact wording, but I know that we were perhaps in a different space where the message that we were trying to portray perhaps wasn't reflected in the four nations. So at different times, Scotland took a different approach, Wales took a different approach than we did. And that must have been why, at that point, that I had perhaps indicated that wasn't where I thought we should be.
And I think it's right, again, just tracing this through, Ms O'Neill, that I think right up until, I think I've got this right, about the 21st of December, there was uncertainty and then a change of position about the bubbling arrangements that there would be in Northern Ireland. And I think it's correct that you reduced the period of time that people would be able to meet for a period of 2 days. Is that correct? Yes. And then there was then effectively a lockdown took place, I think, from about the 26th of December onwards. The inquiry has seen the evidence about infection rates and also about death rates in January as well. In your view, what were the factors which contributed to what happened in the January of 2021?
So I think that, it was very clear from October, from the CMO's statement at that time, that things were gradually deteriorating. They had favoured a 6-week intervention that wasn't achieved. So then we had 4, then we had 2, and a lot of that adds to, given the noise that was being made publicly as well, and leaks and all those contributory factors, that meant that it was difficult in terms of the public's compliance. Also, it was the end of the difficult year, and the public were fed up. Now, we were still doing behavioural analysis and science around, compliance and things like that at that stage, but it was clear people were sufficiently concerned again at that time. But it's winter, people are more indoors. It's a whole combination of factors, I think, led us into what was then a very, very difficult January. And I think the voting against the public health advice is a stark underlining of just some of the complexities of just the nature of governance that we had. But it certainly didn't, not just pinpointing that one thing, but the whole approach around that period clearly led to an increased transmission rate.
All right. My lady, those are all of my questions for Ms O'Neill, but I think there are some other questions.
There are, indeed. Mr Wilcock, is it you?
First Minister, I ask you questions on behalf of the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved families for justice. And my lady and First Minister, many of the topics we've been granted permission to ask questions on have been thoroughly covered by Ms Dobbin, and we thank her for that. But I therefore want to confine myself, First Minister, to asking you questions on 3 separate topics.
Okay.
Topic 1. You told us this morning that in February-March 2020, it was clear to you that the Department of Health were the lead in the government response to COVID, and that despite at different times you asking what else the Executive Office needed to be doing in terms of a wider cross-departmental response, the view of Health was that it was too soon and you had no advice to counter that view. And you'll remember giving that evidence. Do you agree that this uncertainty between you and the Department of Health i.e. the Executive Office and the Department of Health, could only impede ministerial decision-making about Northern Ireland's preparedness and response to the developing coronavirus emergency?
Are you asking me all three at the one time, or?
It's one question. Do you agree?
Oh, yes.
That's concerned?
Yes, I think certainly. I think that in terms of the lessons learned, there's no doubt that it will reflect that we need to be very clear in terms of civil contingencies and when it can be stood up. So yes, I accept that.
And do you recall illustrating this confusion between yourself and the Department of Health by telling us that as far as you were concerned, the invitation to the Department of Health to attend the UK COBRA meetings from 24th of January was never even brought to your attention?
That's correct.
On the other hand, you know, don't you, that on the 12th of February, a cabinet tabletop exercise known as Operation Nimbus to, I quote, rehearse ministerial level decision-making for the UK's pandemic preparedness and response within the context of the current novel coronavirus outbreak took place. You know that, don't you?
I know that now, yes.
Yes. You didn't deal with that in your statement, did you?
I don't recall, but if you're telling me I didn't, then I assume
I'm
I
wrong,
haven't.
someone will tell me. Now, you say you didn't know that, you knew that now. According to Bernie Rooney, who then held a temporary position in the Executive Office as assistant grade deputy director level, the records indicate that on the 6th of February 2020, Mrs Foster, the First Minister then, decided that the Minister of Health should continue to represent Northern Ireland and attend this exercise alone, and that you subsequently confirmed the decision on the 10th of February. Does that accord with your recollection?
It does not.
It does not?
No.
So you think Ms Rooney is wrong in saying that's what the records indicate?
No, I can't say that, but I certainly do not ever recall being asked about that. And if a record is available that reflects that, then I will reflect on that, but certainly no, that's not my understanding.
And you told us this morning that it only became clear to you, quote, as things developed, that you needed to have a wider systems approach to what was happening than just having the Department of Health involved. And do you remember saying that? Mm-hmm. The inquiry heard evidence yesterday from Professors Gray and O'Connor that it ought to have been obvious from an early point that any response to the pandemic was, quote, a cross-cutting issue that was across all departments and required a response from every single department. Are you saying that their expert evidence is unfair?
No, I haven't seen their expert evidence or read their expert evidence. What I have suggested earlier is that very much in those early days, the Department of Health were in the lead and civil contingencies in support, but I have also accepted that we could have had civil contingencies stood up earlier.
Well, the question's a bit more specific than that. It was obvious, wasn't it, right from the start, that the coronavirus, the COVID situation was going to require everyone, all departments, not just the Department of Health. And that must have been obvious right from the start, beginning of February.
I think what was very clear to us as a fledgling executive was that the Department of Health were in the lead in those initial days, and we had no information to counter that wasn't the right approach. But certainly I have accepted that a wider systems approach, which I did then go on to advocate for, and that cross-departmental approach became more clear, but not until March.
And coming back to Operation Nimbus, Mr Swan told us that he had no recollection of his attendance at Operation Nimbus and referred to his limited actions afterwards. I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, but we have not seen any record of you asking him about what happened when he took place in Operation Nimbus. Do I take it from your answer you just don't remember anything about Operation Nimbus, that you can't tell us whether you did speak to him about what happened?
I'm saying I can't reflect, and I would have to look towards the documentation to see if I can find a record of an exchange, but I can't reflect on that as we speak here now. But if I find a record, then I would be more than happy to provide it to the inquiry.
And does the same answer apply if I were to ask you what feedback you got from Mr Swan when he attended that operation? Did he tell you what he had said at Operation Nimbus?
Given that I can't recall the Nimbus operation, then I would have to reflect on that before I could properly answer you.
You've been asked many questions this morning about the steps you took to challenge, scrutinise and ask questions of the Department of Health. They may have felt to you like criticisms. Knowing what you do now, do you not agree that you might have been assisted in overseeing the measures the Department of Health was taking in February if you had been informed by someone about Operation Nimbus rehearsals, as I say, which were of a ministerial level decision-making for the pandemic preparedness and response to coronavirus?
I think that stands to reason.
It does. And I'm going to suggest to you that the lack of communication, if there was any, between you and Mr Swan about this meeting would be a clear example of the political dysfunction between the Department of Health and the Executive Office in the response to COVID from February 2020. I give you that opportunity to comment. You're going to say, I don't remember.
Thank you for that. Communication has been a problem, had been a problem throughout, and I think I've reflected on that, and we must do better. In terms of the dysfunction, I think it's fair to characterise it at times that we weren't in a good place at all, and it was caused difficulties in terms of communicating the public health message. I also would like to be equally fair to my ministerial colleagues, that I believe that people were there to try to do their very, very best. I believe that all ministers were faced with very difficult decisions, and I believe that that we all welcome the fact that the inquiry will assist in terms of the lessons learned and allow us to try to improve things for whenever we do face such, or whoever is in office faces such a position again.
Thank you. Topic 2. You've been asked many questions about your attendance at Mr Story's funeral, and my clients have noted your evidence this morning that you never set out to compound their grief and didn't realise the hurt you had caused, but now accept that you ought to have done. In assessing that evidence, can I ask you about something that the then Minister for the Economy, Mrs Diane Dodds, has said in her sworn statement, in which she explicitly recognises that proceedings can be brought against her if she makes a false statement. Mrs Dodds says in that statement that after the funeral, you indicated that you would do what you did again to attend the funeral of a friend. Have you said what Mrs Dodds alleges?
I believe that in a press statement or a press conference directly after the funeral, I may have said that I would not apologise for attending the funeral of a friend. Subsequently, I have obviously corrected that and said again this morning to my lady, to the families of the bereaved, that I ought not to have went, I should not have went, and I never have set out to hurt people, but I know that my actions did. I want to be very clear and unequivocal in terms of my apology. I would never, ever compound people's hurt, but I know that I did, and I know that I made people angry.
Last question on the topic. At what point did you reach that realisation?
I think it's very clear, with the benefit of hindsight, that I should not have went to the funeral. I'm sorry that I did, and I'm sorry that for the impact. I think it's a realisation on that
First
day.
Minister, that's not an answer to the question. I really don't want to spend too much time on it. At what point did you realise the hurt that you had caused?
As soon as I listened to the many families that I actually have met and engaged with who've lost loved ones throughout the pandemic.
But that was immediate, wasn't it? It was all over the papers.
I don't want to take away from the fact that I want the families to be crystal clear that I want to apologise to them. I want that to be taken in the spirit in which it's intended. I did say I was sorry on a number of occasions, but I think this is the appropriate juncture in which to be as wholesome as I can be on it, that I mean it from the bottom of my heart. I would not have tried to hurt anybody. I did, and I angered people, and I accept that. But I just want to put on record again today to all those families, I am sorry for the experience that you've had, and I am sorry that my actions compounded that.
Thank you. Topic 3. It's right, isn't it, that the Executive Office is the sponsor of the Equality Commission and the department responsible for equality, policy and legislation in the Northern Ireland Executive.
That's correct.
It's also right, isn't it, that Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act 1998, which requires public authorities in Northern Ireland to have regard to any differential, unfair impact of their actions on certain categories of persons, including on the basis of gender, disability and age, was, as you told us this morning, effectively suspended at various times during the pandemic. Do you accept that the consequence of this was, in essence, that actions could be carried out during the pandemic and enforced without any consideration of any unequal impact those actions may have on the individuals or groups of individuals I've just listed?
Yes, I think I said that earlier, that I regret that that's the position that we were in terms of moving forward with blanket lockdowns and the implications that had, particularly for those people more vulnerable, and the fact that the normal EQIA process wasn't conducted. And I indicate that that's one of the areas of lessons learned that we need to appropriately fix for any future juncture.
Can we have a copy of your statement to this inquiry, which is INQ 000436641, and I'm looking at page 23 on the screen. And can we just highlight paragraph 79? I think, First Minister, you should be able to see in this paragraph that you note that you were aware that the health service was in danger of being overwhelmed from March, and that during the 2nd of March Executive Committee meeting, the Chief Medical Officer referred to community transmission of COVID and its detrimental effect on personal services. You then go on to say, he, the Chief Medical Officer, spoke of the need for the Health and Social Services Boards to take difficult decisions on prioritisation, clinical decisions and ethical issues. He spoke about the need to be prepared for weeks and months, and that we were dealing with a very transmissible virus. First Minister, many of those that I represent are concerned that their relatives were effectively given up on, or, to put another way, that some lives were prioritised during the response to COVID. Would you agree that it should have been clear from the warning the Chief Medical Officer gave in this meeting that there were significant equality issues being raised, given that there was a discussion by him of prioritisation in circumstances where it was possible healthcare was going to be overwhelmed?
Yes, and I absolutely accept that when the Chief Medical Officer spoke about the need for difficult decisions to be taken on prioritisation, I recall, and even clinical decisions and ethical issues. I remember having a conversation with them in terms of a patient with cancer, how that service could be downturned. I remember in particular being asked about a lady with 2 children who was told that her cancer treatment would stop. That was the horrific nature of the decisions that were facing those people, particularly within the health service. So it was very clear to us all that there were going to be implications, dire implications for many people, and we tried to mitigate that as best as we can. We could never, as I said earlier, we could never have mitigated against all the implications, but we did try, and I referenced a number of areas where departments worked together. They worked with the community and voluntary sector. We put funding out into community groups. We tried to do all these things. But yes, we didn't reach everybody, and we have to take that on board. And yes, everything was not as you would want it to be in an ideal scenario, of course. We did try our best to mitigate, but I don't think that anybody would accept that we did that in as fulsome a way as what we would have wanted to do.
First Minister, with respect, it's not just a question of taking it on board. One concern that many of those I represent feel is that the safeguards were removed or did not operate properly at a time when people were being isolated from their families, which, as you know, in Northern Ireland is a source of some support to people, and from other professionals such as GPs who could identify any failings in their care. And that includes not only the Section 75 suspension we've spoken about, but also the changes to the RQIA inspections in care homes. And my question to you is this: do you agree that the simultaneous removal of those safeguards, those sort of safeguards, when vulnerable people were isolated, at a time that you were being told that difficult decisions on prioritisation, clinical decisions and ethical issues had to be taken, should have raised alarm bells with you and your colleagues on the executive?
I think it's fair to say that the alarm bells were very much with colleagues on the executive across a whole range of issues. That's why we set about trying to bring in and to use our community structures effectively to try to support people on the ground as close to them in their community as we possibly could. That's why we brought forward the different mitigations that we did in terms of trying to support people. But I think that there's no doubt, like when you're bringing in a lockdown and that sort of society-wide approach, it is always going to, and for the right reasons in terms of trying to reduce the spread of the virus and protect people. But I think even in the context of what we did, of course, we could have done better in mitigating the impact on vulnerable people, harder to reach groups and individuals. And when we reflect on what was done, we can reflect on what was done well, and there were many good things, but we also have to equally reflect on what wasn't done well. And I think there's a range of things that we could refer to there.
And in reflecting on those issues, are you aware, I think you might have mentioned that you are, of the evidence that Marion Reynolds gave in this inquiry in relation to her Aunt Marie?
Yes.
And she told us that Mary went into hospital with pneumonia in September 2020, where she then contracted COVID. Her aunt was deaf, but members of staff were still wearing masks, which prevented her aunt from lip reading. And she described her aunt being admitted to a care home in circumstances where she was not permitted to visit. And when she did eventually get access to her aunt, she found her near death. And she believed that not only was the social isolation that her aunt experienced detrimental to her, but the lack of visiting also meant that family members were not there to be able to identify whether or if relatives were being treated poorly. Now, that treatment, you will accept, is sadly not unusual in the reports of what happened during the pandemic, is it?
I think that's fair to say, and I did listen to Marion and her own personal story and that of her aunt. And unfortunately, it reflects the experience of too many families throughout the pandemic, and that's why I welcome the particular focus on care homes, in particular in a future model. This must be something that we get right, but there's no brushing away that experience. There's no brushing away any family who's been through that experience, and that has to feed into the lessons learned.
You highlight care homes, and we understand why you do, but do you agree that putting the health and lives of the most vulnerable, like Mary Reynolds, at risks in circumstances of enforced social isolation, even if it was done with the best of intentions, was a significant failing on the part of the executive's equality duties, and that this was still occurring many, many months into the pandemic?
I think we had difficult decisions to take at the very outset of the pandemic, including suspending the Section 75 equality screening. But let's not hide behind that. Marion's experience and so many's experience was horrific. And all I can say is that what we did as an executive, particularly in those early days in terms of lockdown, social isolation, all those things that were brought to play, were to try to save lives. They were to try to actually get us, well, to initially to respond to that and suppress the virus. However, the outworking of trying to do that right thing led to the outworking of Marion and her aunt's experience, and that's not a balance that I'm prepared to accept is in any way acceptable, and we must take that on board and ensure that the proper processes are in place, particularly around those most vulnerable in society, and particularly in care homes.
There is, in fact, one more thing you could say. What planning is being done to ensure that in a future pandemic, full consideration will be given from the outset to maintaining the requirements of Section 75 at a time when the history of the pandemic has shown they're most needed?
So I think this is all part of the inquiry's work and what will feed into what we will do. I think we've been able to bring forward some of the transformation work that we would want to see across our systems. The fact that we now have a chief scientific advisor that would help our decision making and our advice. I think there's been a raft of learning, even how we responded to the pandemic the whole way through. It advanced at each juncture. So there are lessons already taken on board, but the inquiry will help assist us in terms of perhaps legislative changes that are required. And I know on a wider issue of meeting with, for example, I want to meet with Disability Action in the time ahead. They have requested a meeting. I have accepted to meet because I think it's important that where legislative changes are necessary or required, that we actually start to progress them now through this newly formed Assembly and Executive now that we're back there and working together. And I think that's where we're going to be able to advance some of these, particularly these pieces of learning.
Well, my lady, that may be an appropriate question for time.
Seems like you've just teed up Mr. Freedman. Thank you, Mr. Wilcock. Mr. Freedman.
First Minister, I think you've actually teed me up because I do act for Disability Action. And may I ask you about some quite emphatic evidence that you have given today that there's a need for soul-searching over the extent to which disabled people like the woman Joanne on the Inquiry Impact film experienced being forgotten and left behind. And if this, as you say as First Ministers, and I've heard other people say it before, is a small place and a small entity where directly or indirectly pretty much everyone does know everyone, I just follow up on something Ms. Dobbin asked you. What is your lesson learned about why politicians in this jurisdiction, who are otherwise deeply engaged in their communities, have not been as equally engaged with disabled ones?
So I can't speak to wider politics. What I can say is that I personally and my ministerial team from we've come into office have, at least two of my ministers have already met with Disability Action as to how we might progress some of the learning, particularly from the work that was taken forward around the lived experience of people with disabilities throughout the pandemic. So I'm committed to that work, and I will meet with Disability Action. I mean, I think I said this earlier, but I listened to I read Nuala Toman's evidence, and you couldn't feel anything other than, deep regret that was the lived experience of so many people. So I want us to learn lessons. I want to work with Disability Action.
Yeah, but if I may, because I understand and accept that you're accepting that going forward there needs to be much more structured engagement. But just thinking back to that time of crisis, why, given that not only the politicians, but in fact a lot of civil servants are deeply engaged in their communities, why do you think that disabled people's communities weren't engaged with looking back?
Well, I don't think it's fair to say that they weren't engaged with in a wholesome way. I do accept that it wasn't perfect, but I know that our Communities Minister tried to set out the level of engagement that she had taken forward, trying to work with groups, trying to provide support. We know that our Finance Minister tried to bring forward financial support to allow particularly community and voluntary sector and charities to do work on the ground. We know that our Communities Minister worked with the Education Minister around free school meals. That's for any child out there in society who needed that. We tried to do the food box approach, which brought it right down to grassroots level. We tried to do the community prescriptions right to people's doors. I mean, I offer all that to say these are the things that we were trying to do with our local knowledge, and that was community and voluntary groups on the ground. It was sports organisations. It was, a whole raft of people that stepped up to help us to support people. Of course, it wasn't.
Well, for instance, we know that neither you, Arlene Foster, or indeed either of the ministers of communities ever met with a DPO, an actual DPO, or Disability Action at any time that the chair is looking at.
So I had agreed to meet with Disability Action, but unfortunately the executive didn't go forward at that time. But that being said,
Only in January 2022.
when I was requested to do so, I did so. But I think, look, I want to be as open as we possibly can in terms of learning. I've set out some of the things that we tried to do. The Communities Minister set out some of the engagement that she took forward. But I know that with Disability Action, with a new strategy coming forward in terms of disability and how we can support people going forward, with legislative provisions that may come forward as a direct result of learning from the pandemic, I think we can do better.
Thank you. Thank you, Manny.
Thank you very much, Mr Freeman. I think that completes the questioning, First Minister. I know it must be a long day and you must have very busy schedules, so thank you for the time that you've given us. And
Thank you. Thank you.
And I think you may be the first witness who's offered to give evidence in another module, so be wary of...
my legal team might roll their eyes at me.
Exactly. Anyway, thank you, everybody.
Thank
10 o'clock tomorrow with Baroness Foster and then ACC, a former ACC, Todd, and then on Thursday it's Sue Gray, and then closing submissions.
That's right, my lady.
Thank you. 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Bye.